Let's tell me a little bit about yourself first.
I've lived in Needham now for about 15 years. I have 3 children. My youngest is at the Williams School. He's a 5th grader. I have a 10th grader. She's at the high school, obviously. And my oldest is actually in her first year of college. I have been a lifelong educator. So I started off as a preschool teacher, and then I moved up to kindergarten, and I spent a number of years specifically focused on literacy instruction for kindergartners. And then I spent the most of my teaching career, classroom teaching career, in grade 1. So I like to joke that I never got past grade 1 in school. But after that, I left the classroom when I had my children, but I started a volunteer organization called Let's Build Engineering Fun for Kids. And anyone watching this may have actually volunteered with us. I co-founded it with a friend, and it's designed to bring engineering and science activities into classrooms in a way that allows children to build things and iterate and to learn to connect the science and the engineering together. Right now, I am working at Lesley and in 2 capacities. I'm adjunct faculty. I teach teachers, especially in the early childhood realm. And I also supervise student teachers. The other thing I do professionally is I work in educational equity. So I'm a consultant, and I work with families, communities, districts to come together and examine equity issues. Beyond sort of all of my work as a person, I love coffee, absolutely adore coffee and chocolate. And in my free time, I like to garden, but I'm actually really bad at it. And I play Scrabble. That's been my pandemic go-to, has been Scrabble against my iPad.
And what makes you want to run for the school committee?
I had always thought that this would be a really sensible way for me to consider giving back because I've already spent so much time in education. However, the last 4 years have really shown me how important it is not just to be involved in the community as a volunteer, but to be aware of and, if possible, involved in local government, and how important it is for there to be people in local government who are able to have conversations about the complexities that exist, right? That the way local governments, state governments, federal governments operate is incredibly complicated. And we need people to come in to be prepared to handle the complexity that is presented to them, and then also do their best to be able to translate that out to their constituents. And so that is actually something I'm really interested in generally, is the complexity of the education system and how do you talk to people who are unfamiliar with it and explain to them how this really complex beast functions or sometimes doesn't function very well.
What changes do you want to make for the district?
I have seen the same, I don't want to call it an issue. I'm not sure what to call it, but the same dynamic play out again and again. And we're seeing it right now with regards to COVID schooling, like how do we go to the next phase of COVID schooling? And what happens is you have various stakeholders in education, right? So you have businesses, you have families, you have teachers, you have administrators, and all of these people, in this case, pretty much everybody wants kids to be back in school full time, right? There's pretty universal agreement on that, it seems. The questions then lie in how does that happen? How quickly does that happen? What are the logistics, like space and money to pay for extra staff, and so on and so forth. And every group of stakeholders is coming forward with a piece that they feel is incredibly important. I envision it as like a knot. So how do you get in there and untangle this knot so that we start because if we don't untangle that knot, it actually is going to impede us from moving forward. So how do we build relationships? How do we get people talking to each other? And how do we start to untangle the knot so that our district can move forward into the next phase of COVID schooling? So that's where I feel like I can make change.
And beyond COVID, what are your priorities for local education?
The first one, since I've spent a lot of time working in educational equity, is equity. It's essentially this. How do we make sure as a district that every single child is getting the opportunities that they need to be a successful adult? So that's priority number one. The second is 21st century learning. And this is an area in which, through Let's Build and also just through my postgraduate work, I have a lot of experience. There is what we need now for the future is different than what we needed 50 years ago. How do we continue, because Needham has already taken some steps on this path, but how do we continue that journey where we are moving into a new set of skills, a new set of priorities, a new style of education that will set all of our students up for the jobs that are going to be available when they hit the job market, which from most sources say that these jobs are going to look very different than what we have now. And in some cases, these are jobs that don't even exist yet. So how do we shift education to meet those needs? And the third, again, coming out of some of my research, is this idea of communication across the community. Again, education is so complex, and stakeholders have often like sort of similar big ideas that they all want to move towards the same target, but each has a different piece that they prioritize. How do we communicate across these different ideas? And especially, I want to add in the equity piece now, that often within a community, like Needham or any other community, there are certain stakeholders who have like a really powerful voice in the community. They are heard for whatever reason. And then likewise, in the broader community, there are people who have a very difficult time being heard.
Where are those unheard voices? Do you have a general idea?
And if you live in a community in which there's a very large range of family incomes, which describes Needham. We have families here who earn millions of dollars, and we also have families who are earning at the poverty threshold. These families actually have very different views of what schools need to be doing. They do not necessarily agree on the goals of schooling. They don't necessarily agree on how you define success, for example. And this is just one study, right? So you got to be careful not to overinterpret, but in this one study, the more sort of money or prestige in terms of work that a family had, the easier it was for them to approach the school and advocate on behalf of their own child's needs. And then the less income families had, the more difficult it was for them to approach the school and advocate. And some did, in fact, do this and were rebuffed. And there were multiple other barriers to these conversations. So that's just sort of one example. And I don't think, and I'm not saying that this is what happens in Needham, right? Because this was not a study of what happens in Needham. This is just some general information, and it's just giving me, it has made me continue to ask questions about who gets heard within a school system and who doesn't, and what that means in terms of policies or what we prioritize as a community if we're only hearing certain members of the community and we're not hearing others.
What is your most important strength that you think people should vote for?
Often we think we can solve educational problems by only dealing with education, when really educational problems are huge and complex. And what we need to do is actually look at many disciplines in many areas and pull information. And I have that background. I have experience with education and from multiple perspectives in multiple arenas. And that is what I would bring with me. And I think that that is the reason that I would be a good candidate for school committee in Needham if people should choose to vote for me.